Tonight there are more than 8 billion of us. We are spread across nearly every patch of dry land on Earth, packed into cities so bright they can be seen from orbit, glowing like spilled stars against the dark side of the planet. We live in towers and suburbs, in apartments stacked 100 feet in the air, in houses that stay in one place for a lifetime. We sleep behind locked doors, beside roads, above buried pipes, surrounded by strangers we will never meet. And almost all of us take it completely for granted. The settled life feels like the most natural thing in the world. It feels like where humans were always heading. But it isn't. Not even close. For something like 300,000 years, our species lived a completely different way. We moved, we followed the seasons, the herds, the ripening of wild plants, the memory of where water gathered after the rains. We carried what little we owned on our backs and left almost nothing behind. We slept under different skies week after week. No house, no fields, no granary, no walls. And here is the part that should stop you for a moment, just as you're settling in to drift off. That way of living was not a failure we escaped. By a great many measures, it was better than what came next. Because somewhere around 12,000 years ago, in a small handful of places scattered across the world, human beings did something genuinely strange. They stopped moving. They built houses that stayed put. They planted seeds and waited months for them to grow. They crowded together in the first villages, then the first towns, then the first cities. And when we dig up the bones of the people who did this, when we measure their skeletons and read the wear on their teeth, we find something almost unbelievable. Those first settlers were, by and large, worse off than the wanderers who came before them. Shorter, sicker, working harder, dying younger of new diseases that thrived in the crowd. The dawn of the settled world, the dawn of everything we now call civilization, looks in the ground less like a triumph and more like a wound. So that is the mystery we are going to lie down inside tonight. If settling down made people's lives harder, who chose it? And why did they keep doing it, generation after generation, until there was no going back? Why did it happen not once but several separate times, in places that had never heard of one another, on different continents, with different plants and different gods? The first cities, in a very real sense, were not supposed to exist. Nobody woke up one morning and decided to invent civilization because it sounded like an improvement. Something pushed, something pulled, something forced the first humans to put down roots in ground they could no longer leave. And what that something was is one of the deepest and most genuinely unsettled questions in the whole human story. And think for a moment about how strange the repetition is. If settling down were simply a clever idea, a trick one brilliant group stumbled onto and passed to its neighbours, we might expect it to spread outward from a single point, like ripples from a stone dropped in a pond. But that is not what the ground shows us. It happened in the hills and river valleys of the Middle East. It happened, quite separately, in the river country of China, with rice and millet instead of wheat. It happened again in the highlands of Mexico, with maize, and in the Andes and in the swamps of New Guinea, and very likely in still more places we are only beginning to understand. Different plants, different animals, different gods, different languages, different skies overhead. Peoples who could not possibly have spoken to one another, separated by oceans and tens of thousands of years, all reached, more or less independently, for the same astonishing and costly idea at roughly the same chapter of the human story. That is not the fingerprint of a fashion spreading from village to village. That is the fingerprint of a pressure, something pushing on the whole species at once, in the same direction, whether anyone wanted it or not. We are going to take it slowly. We have all night. We will walk back into a world without a single building anywhere on Earth, and we will move forward century by century, watching the strangest transformation our species ever went through. We will meet people who settled down before they knew how to farm. We will stand in front of a temple raised by hunters before anyone had planted a field. We will visit the first town with a wall around it, and the first place where thousands of people lived, stacked together with no streets at all, climbing into their homes through holes in the roof. And we will arrive eventually at the first true cities, on a hot southern plain between two rivers, where everything we recognize as the modern world quietly began. Before we go, two small things, and then I will let my voice carry you off. If you are listening to this to fall asleep, that is exactly why it exists. There is no need to stay awake for any of it. Let the words blur. Let the details slip past. You will not miss anything you need. But if you have a moment before you drift, I would love to know where you are right now. Leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from and what time it is for you. It is one of my favourite things about doing this. I will read through and find someone listening in the small hours in Buenos Aires, someone on a grey commute in Manchester, someone in Manila, where the day is just getting started, someone in a quiet bedroom in Ohio, all of us awake or half awake at the same strange moment, somewhere on this crowded planet, kept company by the same slow story. It makes the whole thing feel a little less lonely. So tell me where you are. I really do read them. And if you would like to support what we do here, the very best way is to follow us on Spotify. You can listen there completely free, with no ads to jolt you awake and no background music to distract you, just the story and the dark and the quiet. The link is down in the description. Following along on Spotify genuinely helps more than you would think, and it costs you nothing but a tap. That is all. Get comfortable. Let your shoulders drop. We are going back now, far back, to a green and empty world, long before the first brick was ever laid, when every human being alive was a traveller, and the very idea of a city would have sounded like a kind of madness, because to the people we are about to meet, in a way it was. So let us go there. Close your eyes and put yourself in that green and empty world. You are part of a small band, perhaps 25 or 30 people, almost all of them related to you in one way or another. You have known every face since you were born. There is no leader giving orders, not really, no king, no chief, no one who can tell you what to do and make it stick. There are people whose word carries weight because they are wise or skilled or generous, but there is no throne and there are no taxes, because there is nothing yet to tax. You wake when the light comes, you sleep when it goes, and the whole of your wealth, everything you own in the world, you can pick up and carry in your two hands. This is the life nearly every human being lived for nearly the whole of our existence as a species. When we picture the deep past, we tend to imagine it as a desperate scramble, a grim daily fight against starvation, lives that were, in the famous old phrase, nasty, brutish, and short. And there is no point pretending it was gentle. People died of injuries we would shrug off today. Children were lost, bad years came. But the grim picture, the idea that foragers were always one missed meal from death, turns out to be surprisingly hard to support once you actually look at how such people live. In the middle of the last century, anthropologists began spending long stretches of time with the few groups of mobile hunter-gatherers still living something close to the old way, in the Kalahari, in the forests of Central Africa, in the Australian outback, and what they found genuinely surprised them. These were not people teetering on the edge of collapse. They were, by and large, well fed. They knew their land with an intimacy that is difficult for a city person even to imagine, the kind of knowledge where you can read the age of a footprint, name 200 plants and what each one is good for, predict where the animals will be 3 valleys over by the slant of the season, and startlingly they seem to get all of this done without working themselves into the ground. One anthropologist, Richard Lee, tried to actually count the hours. He followed a group of foragers in the Kalahari and tallied how much time they spent on the work of staying alive, the hunting and the gathering and the food preparation. The numbers he came back with were so modest, that they caused an argument that has never entirely died down. By his reckoning, the basic work of survival took something in the neighbourhood of a few hours a day. The rest of the time was for resting, for visiting, for talking, for making things, for the long, slow social life of a small group of people who have known each other forever. It was another anthropologist, Marshall Sahlins, who gave this idea its memorable name. He called these foragers the original affluent society. And it is worth being careful here because this phrase has been argued over for decades, and you should hold it loosely rather than as a proven fact. Sahlins did not mean that foragers were rich in the way we use the word. He meant something cleverer and stranger than that. There are two roads to affluence, he said. One is the road we know, the road of producing more and more, piling up more goods, more comfort, more stuff, forever chasing wants that grow faster than we can fill them. But there is a second road, and it is the one the foragers were on. You can be affluent by wanting little. If your desires are few and the land around you can meet them, then you are, in the only sense that matters, rich. You have enough. You are not anxious about tomorrow's grain because you do not store grain. You do not fear the loss of your house because you do not have a house to lose. Whether or not Sahlins had every detail right, and serious scholars have pushed back on the rosy version, the underlying point is hard to dismiss. The mobile life had real advantages, and they were not small ones. Consider mobility itself. To us, having to pack up and move sounds like hardship. To a forager, it was insurance, the best insurance a human being has ever had. If the rains failed in your valley, you walked to a valley where they had not. If game grew thin, you followed it elsewhere. If a sickness took hold, you scattered and left it behind. The land was a vast pantry stocked in 1,000 different places, and the great trick of forager life was simply knowing the pantry and being free to move between its shelves. No single failure could ruin you, because you were never staking everything on one spot. A drought that would later in the age of farms mean famine and death was to a forager mostly an inconvenience, a reason to go somewhere else for a while. Consider the diet. A farmer ties his fortune to a handful of crops, sometimes just one or two, and lives or dies by whether those crops come through. A forager ate from an enormous menu. Roots and tubers, dozens of kinds of fruit and nut and seed, fish and shellfish where there was water, birds and their eggs, large game when they were lucky and small game when they were not, honey, grubs, greens, the whole wild larder. When one food failed, another was ripening. This is why the bones of late foragers so often tell a story of decent nutrition. Their bodies were fed by variety, and variety is steadier than abundance. And consider what they did not have, because what they did not have turns out to matter as much as what they did. They had no surplus to hoard, and so they had no real way to become powerful by hoarding. You cannot lord it over your neighbours with stored wealth, if there is no stored wealth, if everything spoils or has to be carried. In group after group, anthropologists found that the old foraging societies were fiercely, almost aggressively equal. The successful hunter who came home with a great kill was not celebrated as a hero. Often he was teased, mocked, cut down to size, the meat passed around and shared out as though it were nothing special. Precisely so that no one could use generosity as a ladder to climb above the rest. They had elaborate customs, in other words, whose whole purpose was to stop anyone from getting too big. They had seen perhaps what we are about to watch happen, and they were guarding against it without ever naming it. This, then, is the baseline. This is the deep, comfortable groove our species ran in for hundreds of thousands of years. Few possessions and few worries, the freedom of the open road, a varied table, a flat society where no one starved while another grew fat. It was not paradise. Nothing real ever is. But it worked. And it worked so well for so unimaginably long that it raises the question more sharply than ever. If this life was so durable, so well suited to us, so deeply ours, then what on earth could have been powerful enough to make people abandon it? What could possibly have been worth trading away the open road for a single patch of ground you could never leave? To begin to answer that, we have to do something uncomfortable. We have to look at the bodies of the people who made the trade and let their bones tell us, in their own quiet way, exactly what it cost them. Bones are honest. A person can tell you their life was good. A monument can boast of a king's greatness. A clay tablet can record whatever the scribe was paid to record. But a skeleton has no reason to lie. It simply registers in its growth and its scars and its slow chemistry what a body actually lived through. And when archaeologists line up the skeletons from just before the great change against the skeletons from just after, when they lay the last foragers beside the first farmers, the bones say something that took the whole field a long time to accept. The first farmers got smaller. This is one of the most consistent findings in the archaeology of the human body, found again and again in different parts of the world wherever this transition can be measured. In the centuries after people took up farming and settled down, average height tended to fall. Not by a trivial amount either, in some places by several inches. The tall, well-built foragers gave way to shorter, slighter descendants. Now, height is not everything, but to a bone specialist it is a kind of summary, a rough running total of how well a body was nourished and how little it was stressed while it was growing. A child who eats well and fights off few illnesses grows close to the full height their genes allow. A child who is hungry at the wrong moments, or sick, or both, falls short, and the first farmers over and over fell short. Their own bodies recorded a decline in the basic quality of life, written in the length of their bones. Then there are the teeth, and the teeth are even more eloquent. Forager teeth, when we find them, are often remarkably good. Worn down, certainly, ground flat by grit and tough wild food, but frequently free of the holes we think of as the universal curse of the mouth. Then farming arrives, and the cavities arrive with it. Once people began to lean their diet on cultivated grains, on porridges and flatbreads heavy with starch, the bacteria in the human mouth were handed a feast, and they took it. Rates of dental decay climbed, teeth rotted in jaws that, a few generations earlier, would have stayed sound. If you could have walked through one of those early farming villages, you might have noticed it in people's faces, in the way they ate, in the quiet, everyday misery of aching, abscessed teeth, a misery so common that it was simply part of being a settled person. The grains left other marks too, grinding wild and then domesticated cereals into something edible meant hours bent over a grindstone, pushing a heavy upper stone back and forth, day after day, year after year. That labour is written into the skeletons of early farming women in particular, in the worn and reshaped bones of their knees and toes and lower backs, the body's record of a task repeated 10,000 times. The foragers had walked the open country, the farmers knelt at the millstone, and the bones tell of hunger of a more specific kind. In many early farming populations, archaeologists find the telltale signatures of poor nutrition and of anemia, including a porous, sieve-like change in the bone of the skull and eye sockets that tends to appear when the body is starved of iron or fighting chronic illness. They find lines etched across the long bones and across the enamel of teeth, faint horizontal marks that form when a child's growth stutters and stops during a season of sickness or starvation, and then resumes, each line a small remembered crisis frozen in the body. Forager skeletons have these marks too. They had hard years. But in many places the marks grow more frequent, not less, once people settled and farmed, which is the opposite of what the old story of triumphant progress would predict. Why would settling down make people sicker? When you start to think it through, the reasons stack up with a kind of grim logic. Begin with the food itself. The forager ate from a menu of dozens or hundreds of wild foods. The farmer narrowed that menu drastically, leaning the whole household on a few crops, sometimes just one. A grain-heavy diet can fill a belly and still leave a body short of the vitamins and minerals and varied proteins that the wild larder had provided almost without effort. People ate more perhaps and ate worse, and they staked everything on those few crops, so that when the harvest failed, there was no wide pantry of alternatives to fall back on, only the terrifying narrowness of the granary running low. Then there is the simple fact of staying still, of so many bodies in one fixed place, which changes a person's relationship with their own waste and their own filth in ways the wandering life never had to confront. A band on the move walks away from its own mess every few days. A settled village sits in it. Water sources nearby grow contaminated. Pests and vermin move in to live alongside the stored grain and the rubbish heaps. The conditions for the spread of disease, which mobility had always kept at bay, were quietly being assembled. And as people began in time to keep animals close, to pen sheep and goats and cattle and pigs beside their homes, they opened a doorway that has shaped human health ever since. Living cheek by jowl with herds of animals gave diseases a bridge to cross from beast to person. A great many of the infections that would go on to scourge humanity for thousands of years appear to have come to us in their deep origins from the animals we domesticated and crowded against. The farmer did not just trade the open road for a field. He moved in with the livestock, and the livestock brought guests. So picture the whole grim ledger laid out. Shorter bodies, rotting teeth, worn joints from endless grinding, the marks of hunger and anemia and arrested growth. New diseases breeding in the crowd and crossing over from the animals. Harder work, narrower food, more children, but more of those children dying young. If you could have shown all of this to a forager, spread the bones out in front of them, and explained what each scar meant, they would have looked at you as though you had lost your mind. Why, they would ask, would anyone ever choose this? Why would a free, well-fed, healthy people walk willingly into a life that bent their backs and rotted their teeth and killed their children? And there, of course, is the heart of the whole mystery, sharpened now almost to a point, because the bones make one thing unmistakably clear. This was not an upgrade. Nobody looked at the settled farming life and recognized in it a better way to live, because in the only terms that a body can measure, it was a worse one. Whatever drove our ancestors to do this, it was not the lure of an easier or richer existence. That comfortable story, the one where clever humans discover farming and gratefully leave their hard wandering behind, simply does not survive contact with the evidence in the ground. So if it was not chosen as an improvement, it must have been something else. A force, a pressure, a trap. Something that backed people into this corner, one careful step at a time, until the open road was no longer open and there was nowhere left to go but down into the village. To understand what that pressure might have been, we have to lift our eyes from the bones and look at the sky. Because just before all of this began, the entire world was changing. The ice that had gripped the planet for tens of thousands of years was beginning, at last, to loosen its hold. For a very long time, the world our ancestors knew was a colder, drier, wilder place than ours. We live in a warm spell, a mild and unusually steady stretch of climate, and it is easy to forget that this is the exception and not the rule. Behind us lies an age of ice. For tens of thousands of years, great sheets of it lay over the north of the world, miles thick in places, locking away so much of the planet's water that the seas themselves dropped, bearing land that is now drowned. The world was windier and dustier. Forests shrank back toward the equator. Deserts spread. And through all of it, the human beings we have been following carried on as they always had, walking the cold open country, following the herds across landscapes that would seem to us harsh and bare. Then, slowly, the ice began to let go. Around 20,000 years ago, the Great Freeze reached its worst, and then, gradually, the planet started to warm. This was not a single smooth slide from cold to comfortable. The climate of that long thaw lurched and staggered. It would warm for a while, then plunge back toward the cold, then climb again, like a fever breaking in fits and starts. But the broad direction was set. The ice sheets over thousands of years began their slow retreat toward the poles. Seas crept back up the drowned land. Rains shifted. Plants that had huddled in scattered refuges began to spread out across newly hospitable ground. The whole stage on which the human story plays out was being rebuilt, scene by scene, across a span of time longer than all of recorded history. And then, just as things seemed to be settling into warmth, the world delivered one last brutal shock. It is called the Younger Dryas, named for a little Arctic flower whose pollen, found suddenly thick in old layers of mud, told scientists that the cold had come roaring back. Roughly 12 to 13,000 years ago, after the long thaw had been steadily warming the planet, the climate slammed in reverse. In the space of what may have been mere decades, much of the northern world tumbled back toward Ice Age conditions. The cold returned, the rains failed. Places that had been growing green and generous turned harsh and dry once more. We are still arguing over exactly what caused it, whether a vast pulse of cold meltwater disrupted the great ocean currents that carry heat around the globe, or some other trigger, and you can hold the cause as an open question. But the effect is not in doubt. For something like 1,000 years, the warming world was thrown back into deep cold. And then, just as abruptly, perhaps within a single human lifetime, the Younger Dryas ended. The warmth returned faster than before, and this time it stayed. Around 11,700 years ago, the planet stepped into the long, mild summer we still live in today. The warm and steady age that gave farming in cities and all of us our chance. And it is that word, steady, that may matter even more than the word warm. Because here is something easy to overlook. Throughout the whole long age of ice, the climate had not only been colder, it had been wildly, violently unstable, swinging from one state to another on timescales of decades, lurching between wet and dry, mild and frozen, with little warning. And you cannot farm in a world like that. Farming is a gamble on the future. You bury good, edible seed in the ground in the spring, food you could have eaten, and you stake the next year on the weather behaving roughly as it did the last. In a climate that might turn on you within a generation, that is a fool's bet, and no sane people would have made it. Only when the world finally calmed, when the seasons began to come around with something like dependable regularity year after year, did it become possible to plant in trust that there would be a harvest. The New Age did not just make the wild fields generous. It made the very idea of farming thinkable for the first time in the whole history of our species. The door to settling down was not only opened by abundance, it was unlocked by calm. Now, why does all of this weather, all this advancing and retreating ice, matter to the question of why humans settle down? Hold the picture in your mind, because this is the stage on which the whole drama plays out, and a particular corner of the stage matters most of all. That corner is a band of land we now call the Fertile Crescent, a great arc sweeping up from the valleys of the Levant along the Mediterranean coast, curving across the hills of what is now Turkey and bending back down through the highlands toward Mesopotamia. It is not all lush, much of it is dry and stony, but it had something rare and precious. It was home in the wild to the ancestors of some of the most important plants in human history. Wild wheat grew on those hills, wild barley, wild rye, wild lentils and peas and chickpeas. The grasses that would one day feed civilizations were already there, growing thick on certain slopes in good years, dropping their hard little seeds for anyone with the patience to gather them. And as the great warming spread after the depths of the Ice Age, these wild grain-bearing grasses seem to have flourished and spread across that landscape as never before. Picture whole hillsides waving with wild cereal, dense enough that a family working with simple tools could, in a few weeks of harvest, gather more grain than they could eat. An experiment was once done where a researcher went out with a flint-bladed sickle into a stand of wild wheat in those hills, and in not very many hours of gathering, brought in a remarkable quantity of grain, enough to suggest that a family could lay in a year's worth of cereal in just a few weeks of the harvest season. The wild fields, in a good year and a good place, were astonishingly generous. Do you feel the trap beginning to close? Here is a food that does not run away when you approach it, the way a deer does. It stands still and waits to be cut. Here is a food that, unlike most fruit and meat, can be dried and stored and kept for months, carrying a family through the lean season. And here, growing thick across whole hillsides, is enough of it to feed a group through a year, if only they are there at the right moment, in that right place, to bring in the harvest before the seeds shatter and fall and are lost. To gather a wild harvest like that, you have to be present. You cannot be 3 valleys away following the herds when the grain ripens, because the window is short and the grain will not wait. And once you have gathered a great heap of it, this heavy, precious, storable wealth, you are not going to simply carry it off across the country on your back. You are going to want to stay near it, to guard it, to live beside it through the winter, eating from it day by day. So the warming world in this one rich corner set out a temptation that the long age of ice had never offered. Stay, it whispered. Stay near the wild fields. There is plenty here, more than you have ever seen standing in one place, and it will keep if you keep it. And some people in some valleys listened. They began to linger. They began to stay through the seasons in places they would once have only passed through. They started to put down something dangerously close to roots. And then, just as a few of them had begun to settle into this comfortable new arrangement, the cold of the younger Dryas came down on them like a closing fist. The generous wild fields, the ones they had begun to depend on, began to fail. To understand what that meant, and what those first reluctant settlers did about it, we need to meet them. They are the people who, more than almost anyone, stand right at the hinge of this whole story. They settled down before they ever learned to farm, and we know them by the name of a cave and a valley where their traces were first found. We call them the Natufians. They lived in the lands at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, across what is now Israel and Palestine and Jordan, Lebanon and Syria, in the centuries that straddle the end of the Ice Age and the long shock of the younger Dryas. They were not farmers. Let us be very clear about that, because it is the whole point of them. The Natufians planted no fields. They bred no crops. They were, by every definition we use, hunter-gatherers living off the wild. And yet when we uncover the places where they lived, we find something that should not, by the old story, exist at all. We find that they stayed. They built houses, not grand ones, but real ones, round, and partly sunk into the ground, with low walls of stone and floors that were used and reused and built over. They came back to the same spots season after season, year after year, generation after generation, until the rubbish and the rebuilding raised the ground into low mounds you can still find today. These were not camps that a band threw up for a night and abandoned. These were homes lived in long enough and steadily enough that we would not hesitate to call the people who made them settled. They settled down, in other words, while they were still hunter-gatherers. They put the cart before the horse. They got the staying without the farming, and in doing so they quietly turned the whole expected order of history upside down. How did they manage it? They managed it because of those generous wild fields. The Natufians lived in a sweet spot, a landscape rich enough in wild resources that a group could stay in one place and still be fed. The wild cereals grew thick on the nearby hills, ready to be harvested with the little sickles we find among their tools. flint blades set into handles of bone, some of them worn with a particular sheen along the cutting edge, the polish that comes from cutting grass stems and silica, the unmistakable signature of harvesting grain. They gathered acorns and almonds and pistachios from the wild trees. They hunted gazelle, which moved through their lands in great numbers, and trapped birds, and took fish and shellfish where the waters allowed. The land around them was, for a while, a standing feast, and so they did the thing no people in that region had really done before. They stopped moving toward the food, and let a settled life grow up around the food instead. And once people stay in one place, an extraordinary number of things begin to change, almost without anyone deciding. The Natufians ground their wild grain and their nuts in heavy stone mortars, some of them too large and too heavy to carry, cut right into the bedrock or into great immovable boulders, the very opposite of a forager's portable kit. They made beads and pendants from shell and bone and stone and wore them and were buried with them. They kept dogs. In one famous and tender grave, a person was laid to rest with a hand resting on the body of a puppy, one of the oldest signs we have anywhere of the bond between human and dog, a small gesture of affection reaching across 12,000 years to touch us still. And they buried their dead at home. This, more than almost anything, marks the great shift in the mind that comes with staying still. A wandering people leave their dead behind them on the trail, in the ground of a place they may never see again. But the Natufians buried their dead beneath the floors of their houses, under the very ground where the living ate and slept, keeping the ancestors close, folding them into the home. Some of these burials are elaborate, the bodies arranged with care, adorned with ornaments of shell and bone. In some, in a haunting practice that would echo down through the next several thousand years of this story, the skull was later removed from the buried body and kept apart, treated specially as though the dead remained members of the household present and consulted and honoured long after the breath had gone. To settle down was not only to keep your grain in one place, it was to keep your dead in one place, and through them to bind yourself to the ground in a way a traveller never could. So here is a people who had, in a sense, the best of both worlds, the richness and freedom of the wild, but with the comforts of a real home, the storable grain, the stone hearth, the company of dogs, the nearness of the ancestors. For a while, in the warm, generous centuries after the ice, it must have seemed like a discovery without a cost. They had found a way to be settled and well-fed, and still free of the grindstone of true farming. They had reached, perhaps without quite knowing it, the gentlest possible version of the settled life. And then the trap sprang shut. The younger Dryas came down on their world. The cold returned, the rains failed, and the generous wild fields the Natufians had built their whole settled way of life around began to wither. The standing feast thinned out, the hills that had waved with wild cereal grew sparse and stingy, and the Natufians were now caught in a way their wandering ancestors never could have been. A truly mobile people faced with failing fields would simply have walked on, scattered, returned to the wide and forgiving life of the road. But the Natufians had houses now. They had heavy stone mortars cut into the bedrock. They had their dead beneath their floors and their ancestors in the walls. They had built a life that was rooted to particular places, and when those places turned against them, they could not so easily pull the roots back up. Some of them, no doubt, did scatter and return to a more mobile life. But others stayed and tried to hold on, and in their holding on they were pushed toward a desperate and world-changing solution. Because here is the thing about people who have learned, in the good years, exactly where and how the wild grain grows, who have harvested it and stored it and ground it for generations. Such people know precisely what a seed is, and what it does when it falls on open ground, and how a fistful of last year's grain, pressed into the soil, can become a whole stand of this year's. When the wild fields failed them, the knowledge to make their own fields was already in their hands. They had only to do deliberately and out of need what they had watched the wild do on its own 1,000 times. They had only to take some of the precious stored grain, the grain they could have eaten, and bury it in the ground, and gamble that it would come back multiplied. That is the moment, or something close to it, when farming may truly have begun. Not as a brilliant invention dreamed up by a people looking to improve their lives, but as a last resort, a desperate patch on a settled way of life that was suddenly falling apart. The cold did not invent farming. The Natufians did not set out to. But a settled people, squeezed by a failing climate, with stored grain in their hands and the knowledge of seeds in their heads, were manoeuvred into it, step by step, until there was no other way to feed the village they refused to abandon. Sedentism first, crisis second, farming third as the answer to the crisis. The order is everything, and it overturns the comfortable old tale completely. We did not invent farming and then settle down to enjoy its fruits. We settled down first for reasons of wild abundance and the comforts of home, and then, when that abundance failed us, we invented farming because by then we had trapped ourselves and there was nothing else left to do. But the Natufians and their stored grain and their ancestral skulls are only one thread of this. Because at almost exactly the same hinge of time, a few hundred miles to the north on a wind-swept hill, hunter-gatherers were doing something even stranger and even harder to explain. They were raising the oldest great monument on earth, and they were doing it, as far as we can tell, before they had so much as a single planted field. The hill is in the southeast of modern Turkey, near the old city of Urfa, a rounded swell of land rising above the surrounding country. For thousands of years it was just a hill. Local farmers worked its slopes. Its name in the local tongue means more or less pot-belly hill for its gentle rounded shape. Archaeologists had even glanced at it once, decades ago, seen some broken stone and limestone slabs, assumed it was nothing more than an abandoned medieval graveyard, and moved on. The single most astonishing discovery in the story of how civilization began sat there under the grass, unsuspected for the better part of the 20th century. Then, in the mid-1990s, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt came to take another look, and he understood almost at once that everyone before him had been wrong. What lay beneath that hill was not a graveyard. It was something nobody had imagined could exist. Buried in the slope, deliberately covered over by the very people who made it, were great rings of standing stone. Massive pillars, some of them taller than a person, and weighing many tons, carved into a distinctive T-shape and set upright in circles, with two especially large pillars standing at the centre of each ring, like the figures at the heart of a gathering. And carved into the stone in low relief, and sometimes almost in the round, was a menagerie of wild things. Foxes, snakes, scorpions, wild boar, cranes and vultures. The great cats, all rendered with a confidence and skill that takes the breath away. On some of the central pillars, arms and hands are carved along the sides, and a belt and a loincloth at the base, as if the stone itself were a vast, abstract, watchful being. This was a monument, a place built not to live in, not to store grain in, not for any obvious practical use at all, but a place built, it seems, to gather, to face these great carved stones, to do whatever it was they came there to do. And here is the detail that turned the whole study of human origins on its head. We can date roughly when these rings were raised. The oldest of them go back something like 11,500 years, which places their building astonishingly early, right at the very dawn of the settled world, in the same deep window of time as the Natufians to the south. And the people who quarried these many-ton pillars, who carved the animals, who dragged the stones into place and raised them upright and set them in their rings, appear to have been hunter-gatherers. There is little sign in the early phases of farming. No fields of domesticated grain, no herds of domesticated animals. The bones in the rubbish are the bones of wild game. The plants are wild plants, By every sign we can read, this colossal thing was built by people who still lived off the wild. Sit with how strange that is. The old story, the comfortable one, ran in a clear and sensible order. First, people invent farming. Farming produces surplus food. Surplus food frees some people from the daily search for dinner. Those freed people can then become priests and builders and artists, and only then, with full bellies and free hands, can a society afford to raise great monuments to its gods. Civilization in that telling is something you can only afford once farming has made you rich. Religion and monuments are the luxury that comes last, the flour on top of the grain. Göbekli Tepe, if we are reading it rightly, turns that order completely around. Here is a monument that comes first, raised by people who had not yet invented the farming that was supposed to make such a thing possible. And that led Klaus Schmidt to a genuinely revolutionary suggestion, one you should hold as a striking idea still very much under debate, not as a settled fact. What if it was not farming that made the temple possible? What if it was the temple that made farming necessary? Think it through gently, the way you might turn a stone over in your hand. Suppose that across this whole region, scattered bands of hunter-gatherers shared something, a set of beliefs, a reverence for these wild beasts, a need to gather at a sacred place. Suppose that the urge to come together, to raise these stones, to hold whatever rites were held in those rings, drew people to this hill from far around, in numbers and for stretches of time that no ordinary forager camp ever required. Now you have a problem that is also perhaps an engine. You have crowds gathering at a fixed place, and crowds have to be fed. Feeding a great gathering of people in one spot over and over year after year is exactly the kind of pressure that might push a people toward controlling their food supply more tightly, toward harvesting the wild cereals of the surrounding hills more intensively, toward tending them, encouraging them, and at last cultivating them outright. In this strange and beautiful idea, it is not full bellies that give rise to the temple. It is the temple and the hungry crowds it summons that drive people toward the fields. The sacred came first, and farming followed in its wake to feed the faithful. It is a haunting thought, and it deserves to be held with care, because the picture is changing even as we speak. Göbekli Tepe did not stand alone. In the same region, archaeologists have since found a whole cluster of related sites, a landscape of these early monumental places that researchers have nicknamed the Stone Hills, with names like Karahan Tepe, where more pillars and astonishing carvings keep coming out of the ground. And as the digging goes on, the simple dramatic picture of a pure temple built by pure nomads has grown more complicated. There are hints that people may have lived at or around these sites, not merely visited them. There are signs that the road toward managing and cultivating plants may already have been underway. The line between a temple and a town, between a gathering place and a home, turns out to be blurrier than the first headline suggested. This is not a settled story. It is a story being actively rewritten, season by season, as the spades go deeper into those Anatolian hills. But strip away the arguments over the details, and a stubborn, marvellous fact remains. Before our ancestors had cities, before they had villages worthy of the name, before, as far as we can tell, they had farms, they had this. They had the will and the skill and the shared belief to drag many-ton stones across the land and raise a great ringed monument on a hill, and to do it together, in numbers, working as one. Whatever it was that first pulled scattered, free, wandering people together into the dense and rooted life that would eventually become the city, it was not only hunger, and it was not only climate. Something was moving in the human spirit. Some need to gather, to build, to share a sacred place. The very oldest monumental thing our species ever made was not a granary or a fort or a palace. It was, it seems, a temple. And that may be one of the most important clues we have to the whole mystery of why we ever stopped wandering at all. We have gathered now several threads, a warming, steadying world, generous wild fields and the temptation to stay, a cold shock that turned the fields against the people who had come to depend on them, and a strange pull toward gathering and building that ran even deeper than the belly. It is time to lay these threads side by side and ask the question this whole story has been circling. When the experts argue late into the night over what truly forced humans to settle, what exactly are the answers they reach for? The honest answer, the one a careful scholar will give you if you press them, is that nobody knows for certain, and that the truth is almost certainly not one thing but several things tangled together. But over the long decades that people have puzzled over this, a handful of great explanations have risen to the top, each with its champions, each capturing some piece of the truth, none of them quite enough on its own. Let me lay them out for you one by one, like stones set in a row, and you can turn each over as you drift. The oldest of the great theories belongs to a scholar named Vere Gordon Childer, who the better part of a century ago gave the whole transformation the name we still half use today. He called it the Neolithic Revolution, and he reached for the climate to explain it. His idea, in its simplest form, has come to be known as the oasis theory. As the Ice Age ended and the world grew warmer, and in his telling drier, Childer imagined the land parching, the water retreating to scattered oases and river valleys. People, plants and animals, he supposed, were all driven together by the drought, crowded into the last well-watered places, thrown into a forced intimacy. And in that enforced closeness, he argued, humans began to tame the plants and animals huddled alongside them, and so farming and herding were born of a shared desperation around the shrinking water. The details of Childer's picture have not held up especially well. The climate story turned out to be more complicated, and less uniformly dry than he thought. But the deep shape of his idea, that a changing climate herded people and resources together and forced a new relationship between them, has never really gone away. It simply got more sophisticated. We met its modern descendant a little while ago, in the cruel timing of the younger Dryas. A second great theory looks not at the sky, but at the sheer number of people. Call it the population pressure idea. Its argument runs like this. In the good, warm, generous centuries, with the wild fields lush and the game plentiful, human numbers in the richest regions crept upward. Settled and semi-settled people, no longer spacing out their children the way constant travel encourages, had more babies who survived. And a growing population in a fixed region is a slow-building pressure with nowhere to vent. Eventually there are more mouths than the wild land, gathered in the old free way, can comfortably feed. And at that point a people face a hard choice. They can fight, or fragment, or starve, or they can squeeze more food out of the same ground, by tending it, weeding it, sowing it, cultivating it. Farming, in this view, is what you are driven to when there are simply too many of you to go on living the easy old way. It is not a gift. It is the price of your own success at staying alive and multiplying. A third theory is stranger and more human than either, and I find it the most quietly fascinating of them all. It looks past climate and population to something in the social heart of us. It is sometimes called the feasting theory, and one of its great champions is an archaeologist named Brian Hayden. Picture a society that for the first time has the chance to produce a little more than it strictly needs, a surplus. What do ambitious people do with surplus? They throw a feast. They invite the neighbours. They lay out a generous spread. They make themselves admired and important and owed. And a rival not to be outdone throws a bigger feast. And now you have an arms race, not of weapons but of generosity, a slow contest of prestige in which the way to rise is to give away more food than anyone else, more lavishly, more often. To win that game you need ever more surplus, more grain, more meat, more of everything, reliably, on demand. And so in the quest to outfeast your rivals and climb the social ladder, You are driven to produce more and more food in more and more controlled ways, to store it, to manage it, and at last to farm it deliberately. In this telling, the first fields were planted not to fill empty stomachs, but to fuel the deep human hunger for status, for respect, for the chance to be the one whose table everyone remembers. Farming as vanity, farming as ambition. It is a strange and very recognizable idea. And then there is the thread we picked up on that windswept hill, the suggestion that what pulled people together in the first place was the sacred, the need to gather at a holy place, to build, to worship in numbers, to bind a scattered people into one congregation. In this view, the deepest engine was neither belly nor babies nor vanity, but belief, the pull of shared ritual drawing the wandering bands into denser and more frequent gatherings, until feeding those gatherings made the fields a necessity. Now, here is the thing to hold gently as you listen to all four. They are usually told as rivals, as if one must be right and the others wrong. But step back, and you can see that they need not compete at all. A warming, then suddenly cold, climate could squeeze people toward the rich valleys. The rich valleys could let their numbers swell. Swelling numbers could sharpen the contests for status and the feasts that fed them. And through all of it, the pull of the sacred could be drawing people together into ever larger gatherings. These are not four answers fighting for one throne. They are four hands pushing on the same heavy door from slightly different angles all at once. And a heavy door, pushed by four hands together, will open when no single hand could have moved it. That more than any one clever theory may be the real shape of the truth. Not a cause, but a conspiracy of causes, all converging on the same handful of valleys at the same hinge of time, until people who would never have chosen any of this were eased and pressed and tempted and frightened across the line into the settled world, one small reasonable step after another. Before we follow them across that line, let me pause for just a breath, in case you are still with me and not yet drifting. If this is the kind of story that pulls at you the deep, half-lit origins of who we are, the things that happened so long ago that we can only reach them now through bone and stone and careful guessing, then you might like the book we have made about exactly these prehistoric secrets. It gathers up a great deal more of this kind of thing, the strange and beautiful early chapters of the human story, to read slowly and wander through at your own pace. You can find it on our website, sleepytimehistory.com, and just now this week there is a discount on it as a small thank you for listening. There is no rush and no need to stir. It will be there in the morning at sleepytimehistory.com whenever you would like to look. Now settle back, because we have spent a long time circling the question of why people first stepped toward the settled life. And we have seen that, however it happened, it was less a choice than a slow closing of a trap. But we have not yet looked closely at the trap itself, at the precise mechanism by which a free, wandering people could be eased into a rooted life, and then find, to their horror or their indifference, that the door behind them had quietly swung shut, and the road home was gone. The cruelty of the trap is that every single step into it felt reasonable. That is what makes it a trap, and not a blunder. No one took a great foolish leap. People took small, sensible, well-meant steps, each one a slight improvement on the moment before, and the steps added up over generations to a place from which there was no walking back. Let me show you the door swinging shut, hinge by hinge, because once you see the mechanism, the whole mystery softens into something almost gentle, almost forgivable. It begins, as we have seen, with staying near the wild fields, then with storing some of their grain. And storage is the first hinge, the first quiet turn of the trap, because storage changes everything about how a group of people lives. A forager owns the wild larder of a whole landscape, but owns it in common, in passing, taking what is needed and moving on. The moment you have a store of grain, though a heap of dried edible wealth that will keep through the lean months, you have something altogether new under the sun. You have property that sits still. You have a thing that can be counted, hoarded, defended, inherited, and stolen. And you have, for the first time, a powerful reason never to leave it. The grain in the pit is the food that will get your family through winter. You cannot wander off and abandon it. You must stay near it, watch it, guard it. The store that was meant to free you from the fear of hunger becomes the chain that binds you to one spot. The second hinge is the seed itself, and the long, slow, unintended taming of the plants. When people began, even casually, to scatter some grain and harvest what came up, they set in motion a change they could not have foreseen. Out in the wild, a cereal plant survives by scattering its seeds violently the moment they ripen, the seed head shattering, flinging the grain to the wind so it falls and takes root. But a plant that shatters drops its seed on the ground before a harvester can gather it. The plants people brought home season after season were inevitably the ones whose seed heads held together a little longer, the rare mutants that did not shatter, because those were the ones still standing to be cut and carried back, and by chance re-sown. Generation by generation, without anyone intending it, the plants in human care drifted away from their wild kin. They grew larger seeds. They held those seeds tight instead of casting them to the wind. And in time they crossed a threshold. They became so dependent on people to free and plant their seed that they could no longer reproduce on their own. We had made plants that needed us. But the bargain ran both ways, and this is the part that catches in the throat. For just as surely we had made ourselves into people who needed the plants, who had reorganized a whole existence around their planting and tending and harvest, and who could no longer simply walk away into a wild that had grown too thin and too distant to feed us. There is a famous and provocative way of putting this, and you should take it as a vivid lens rather than a literal account, but it is worth turning over in the dark. It is sometimes said that we did not domesticate wheat so much as wheat domesticated us. Look at it from the wheat's point of view. The writer Yuval Noah Harari has suggested, a little mischievously. 10,000 years ago, wild wheat was just one scrubby grass among many, growing in a small corner of the Middle East. And then within a few thousand years, it had spread across vast stretches of the planet, tended and watered and protected and propagated by a devoted servant species that cleared the land of its rivals, carried it to new continents, and bent its own back daily to its needs. By the only measure evolution recognizes, the sheer spread of one's kind across the earth, wheat was the spectacular winner of that bargain, and we who broke our bodies stooping over it were arguably the ones who had been tamed. It is a way of seeing that turns our pride upside down. We tend to imagine farming as the moment humanity took command of nature. The wheat's eye view whispers that it might equally have been the moment a clever grass took command of us. But whichever way you choose to read it, the result is the same, and it is the heart of the trap. With every generation, the settled farming life put down deeper roots that could not be pulled up. Population is the third great hinge, and perhaps the most merciless. A mobile forager mother could carry only one small child at a time across the long distances of the road, and so children were spaced years apart, and numbers grew slowly. But a settled mother, staying in one place, with stored grain to make soft foods for the young, could raise children closer together. Settled populations swelled, and here is the terrible arithmetic. More people need more food, which means more land must be farmed, which feeds still more people, who need still more food. It is a ratchet that turns only one way. Once your numbers have grown on the back of farming, you cannot simply choose to go back to foraging, because the old wildlife could never have fed so many. The land that supported a few hundred wanderers could not support the few thousand farmers their descendants had become. To abandon the fields now would not be a return to freedom. It would be famine. The very success of farming, the extra mouths it brought into the world, slammed the door on any retreat, because there were now far too many people to feed in any way but the new one. So picture the whole trap, fully sprung. You cannot leave because your stored grain is here, and you would starve without it. You cannot go back to the wild, because there are too many of you now and the wild could never feed your numbers. You depend utterly on plants that depend utterly on you. The two of you locked together, unable to let go. And you work harder than your free ancestors ever did, and your body pays for it in the ways the bones recorded. And somewhere in the back of the collective memory there may even linger old stories of an easier, freer time, a garden you have somehow been cast out of. But you cannot return, not because anyone is stopping you, because the door has closed quietly behind you and your parents and their parents, one reasonable step at a time, and the road home is simply, finally, gone. This is the deepest answer, I think, to the question of why the settled life persisted, even though it cost people so dearly. It was not that anyone judged it better. It was that, once begun, it could not be undone. A trap does not need to be pleasant to hold you. It only needs to close. And so, held fast in that closing trap, with no way back to the open road, our ancestors did the only thing left to do. They leaned into the settled life. They made the best of the corner they were caught in. They began to build and to organize and to gather in numbers that no forager band had ever known. And in one famous place on the floor of an old valley beside a never-failing spring, they did something that announced, more plainly than anything before it, that they were here to stay and that they meant to defend their staying. They built a wall. The place is Jericho, down in the deep valley of the Jordan, far below the level of the distant sea, in a hot and sunken land where the air shimmers and the hills stand back from a green smudge on the valley floor. The reason there is anything green there at all, in that parched country, is a spring. A steady, generous spring of fresh water has welled up at that spot for longer than anyone can say, and around it, in the midst of the dry land, life gathers. Where there is reliable water in a thirsty country, there will be people, and at Jericho there have been people on and off, and then on again, for a very, very long time, long enough that the town has a fair claim to being among the oldest continuously inhabited places on the whole face of the earth. People have dug deep into the great mound that Jericho became, the layered hill built up out of thousands of years of mud brick houses raised, collapsed, and raised again on the same spot, and far down, near the bottom, in layers that date back something like 11,000 years, they found something that stopped them cold. They found a wall, not a house wall, not a garden wall, but a town wall, a great encircling barrier of stone, built around the settlement. It was made of undressed stones heaped and fitted into a massive rampart, and it ran around the community, and in places it survives to a surprising height even now after all these millennia. And set against the inside of that wall, the diggers found something even more startling, a tower. A solid round tower of stone built up many feet high, with a stairway hidden inside it climbing to the top. To raise these things, the wall and the tower, the people of early Jericho had to quarry and haul and stack an enormous tonnage of stone, by hand, with no metal tools, no draft animals to speak of, nothing but human muscle and human cooperation, organized on a scale that simply had no precedent in the whole prior history of our kind. Stop and feel the weight of that. These were people only a few steps removed from the wandering foragers we began with. And here they were, pooling the labour of the whole community, year upon year, to build something monumental, something that belonged to no single family but to the settlement as a whole. The Wall of Jericho is one of the first times in the human story that we can see a large group of people subordinating themselves to a shared project bigger than any of them, a project that required planning, coordination, the giving of orders and the following of them on a scale that the flat, free, equal life of the forager had never demanded. To build that wall, Jericho had to become something more than a cluster of households. It had to become, in some sense, a single thing, a community that could act as one. Picture the work of it. Picture a morning in that valley 11,000 years ago, the heat already rising off the stones, and dozens upon dozens of people out at the edge of the settlement, not hunting, not gathering, not tending their own small plots, but labouring together on this one vast thing that would feed no one and shelter no single family. Someone has to decide which stones, and from where. Someone has to organise the carrying, the long lines of people moving rock from the quarry to the rising wall. Someone has to plan the tower, to keep its round shape true as it climbs, to set the hidden stair turning up inside it. And all the while those labourers have to be fed, which means others are working to feed them, growing and grinding and cooking for mouths that are busy building rather than farming. A wall like this is not just a heap of stones, it is a sign frozen in rock that a few hundred people had learned to act as a single coordinated body, to set aside their own immediate needs for a shared work that none of them would have undertaken alone. That capacity, the capacity to organize many hands toward one end, is the hidden engine of everything that civilization would later build. And at Jericho, we may be watching it stir into life for one of the first times anywhere on earth. And here is where it grows genuinely mysterious, because nobody is quite certain what the wall was for, and the leading guesses tell us very different things about what life had become. The most obvious thought is defense, that the wall was raised to keep enemies out, that settled people with stored grain had become a tempting target for raiders, and had to learn for the first time to fortify themselves against other human beings. If that is right, then the wall is a dark milestone, the first hard architecture of war, proof that the new-rooted life had bred a new fear, the fear of being attacked for the wealth you could no longer carry away and hide. But not everyone is convinced. Some have argued that the wall was built against water, not men, a barrier and a system to protect the settlement from the floods and the mud that came roaring down the valley in the wet season, an early piece of communal engineering against a hostile landscape. Others suspect the Great Tower at least was something stranger still, something with a meaning we have lost, a ceremonial structure, a marker, a thing aligned with the hills or the seasons or the dead, whose purpose was as much in the mind as on the ground. The truth is we do not know, and you can hold all of these as live possibilities, but notice that every one of them tells the same underlying story. Whether against raiders, against floods, or for the gods, the wall of Jericho is a monument to permanence, to a community digging in, declaring by the sweat of building that this place was theirs, and that they were not going anywhere. And the people inside that wall did something else that reaches across the gulf of years and touches the same nerve the Natufians touched, only stranger. They kept their dead close, beneath the floors of their homes, as their ancestors had. But at Jericho, in those deep early layers, archaeologists found a practice so vivid and so haunting that it is hard to forget once you have heard of it. They would take the skull of a dead person, and over the bare bone they would model the features of a face, building the flesh back up in plaster, shaping the cheeks and the brow and the nose, and setting into the eye sockets shells, so that the dead seemed to gaze out once more. These plastered skulls, some of them remarkably gentle and lifelike, were kept, handled, displayed, treasured, the remembered faces of grandparents and parents made present again, the ancestors not buried and forgotten but held on to, brought up out of the ground and given back their faces, so that the family line, the household, the unbroken thread of belonging to this place, could be seen and touched and honoured. To live in early Jericho was to live among your remembered dead, their faces shaped in plaster, watching over the rooms where you ate and slept. The bond to the place was a bond to the buried, and the buried were not allowed to truly leave. Here then, in this sunken green valley around its faithful spring, we can watch the settled life taking on a shape we begin to recognise. A real community, large and permanent and rooted, pooling its labour on great shared works, fortified behind a wall, gathered around its ancestors, declaring with stone and plaster that it was here for good. This was no longer a band. It was a town, perhaps the first thing in the world that fully earns the name. And yet, for all its size and ambition, Jericho was still loosely organized, still without the great pyramids of rank and power that the future would bring. To see what happened when even more people pressed together into a single place, when the village swelled into something denser and stranger than anyone had yet attempted, we have to travel north and a little forward in time, up onto the high plains of Anatolia. There, thousands of people once lived crammed together in a way so unlike any town you have ever seen that, when you first try to picture it, the mind almost refuses. There were no streets at all. Try to build the picture in your mind, slowly, as you lie there in the dark. Imagine a great honeycomb of houses, hundreds upon hundreds of them, packed so tightly against one another that they share their walls with no gaps between, no lanes running through, no alleys, no streets, no doors in the ordinary sense at all. The houses pressed together into one continuous mass, a single sprawling structure made of mud brick, spreading across the plain like a vast clay reef. And the only way into your home is from above. You climb a ladder up onto the flat roofs, and the rooftops are the streets, a whole second landscape up in the open air where people walk and work and talk and pass from house to house. And when you reach your own roof, you lower yourself down through a hole in it, down a ladder, into the dim, smoky, warm interior where your family lives. This was Çatalhöyük, on the high plains of central Turkey, and for well over 1,000 years, beginning around 9,000 years ago, several thousand people made their lives there in this strange, close, roof-walking way. It is one of the largest and most fully settled communities of its great age that we know anywhere, and walking through what remains of it, even in the imagination, is a deeply disorienting thing, because it is so utterly unlike our idea of a town. We think of a town as a thing organized around its public spaces, its squares and streets and marketplaces, the open ground between buildings where the shared life happens. Çatalhöyük had almost none of that. It was, in a sense, all building and no between. Life happened on the roofs above and in the private rooms below, and the community was less a collection of separate houses along a road than a single dense organism of dwellings grown together. To get from one side of the settlement to the other, you did not walk down a street. You walked across the rooftops of your neighbours, over the top of the whole living, breathing mass of the town. Down inside the houses, the rooms were kept astonishingly clean, and ordered, their floors swept, their walls replastered again and again, season after season, layer over layer, until the white plaster lay thick as the bark of an old tree. There was a hearth and an oven, usually set near the ladder so the smoke could find its way up and out through the roof entrance, which is why so many of the people of Çatalhöyük seem to have breathed a great deal of soot, their lungs and even the insides of their ribs darkened by a lifetime of indoor fires. There were raised platforms along the walls where people sat and slept and worked. And beneath those platforms, beneath the very floors where the family lived its daily life, they buried their dead. Here again, across hundreds of miles and many centuries from the Natufians and from Jericho, we find the same profound impulse, the dead kept not in some distant ground, but right there underfoot, under the sleeping platform, woven into the fabric of the home. A family at Çatalhöyük lived quite literally on top of its ancestors, and as at Jericho, sometimes a skull would later be lifted from a grave and kept, passed among the living, the bond with the buried refusing to be broken even by death. The walls of those rooms were not bare. The people of Çatalhöyük painted them, and they shaped them, and what they chose to put there opens a small window onto a mind very far from our own. There are paintings of wild creatures, of hunts, of great horned beasts surrounded by tiny leaping human figures. There are abstract patterns, geometric designs that may have meant a great deal to those who lived among them, and that we can now only stare at. Most striking of all, they brought the horns of wild cattle, the massive curved horns of the aurochs, into their houses, and set them into the walls and the platforms, rows of horns jutting from the plaster. The bench you sat on tipped with the horns of a beast your people had killed. To live in such a room was to live surrounded by the remembered power of the wild animals. Their images on the walls, their horns at your elbow, their hunts painted above your head. The settled people had left the open country behind, but they had carried its great beasts indoors with them, fixed them to the walls, kept them close the way they kept their dead close, as if they could not quite let go of the wild even as they sank ever deeper into the rooted life. Among the most haunting of those images are the birds. On certain walls, archaeologists uncovered painted scenes of great vultures, wings spread wide, looming over small headless human figures, and many have read these as a glimpse of how the people of Catalhoyuk may have dealt with at least some of their dead, leaving the body out in the open for the birds and the elements to strip it clean, before the bones were gathered and brought back beneath the floor. We cannot be certain that is what the paintings mean, and you should hold the interpretation lightly. But the image lingers, a people who lived pressed among their ancestors and may have given some of their dead first to the sky, then to the earth beneath their own beds, the cycle of life and death folded right into the walls and floors of the home. And we should not romanticize the closeness of it, because to live that way was also, surely, to live amid a constant low friction that the open road had never imposed. No privacy to speak of, the cries of a neighbour's child coming through a shared wall, the smell of 1,000 hearths and 1,000 bodies, and the refuse of so many lives heaped at the settlement's edge, the soot in every lung, the quarrels that must have flared when so many people, who could not simply walk away from one another, were packed together year upon year. The settled life did not only cost people their height and their teeth, it cost them, too, the spaciousness of the old existence, the room to move apart when tempers rose. And yet they stayed, and made it work, and that working is its own quiet marvel. And here is one of the quietest and most fascinating mysteries of Catalhoyuk. For all those thousands of people pressed together for all those centuries, archaeologists have found surprisingly little sign of the thing we might most expect: a ruler, a chief, a hierarchy, a centre of power. The houses are remarkably alike. There is no grand palace looming over humble huts, no obvious temple set apart from the homes, no district of the rich and another of the poor. The differences between one household and the next seem modest. It looks, as far as we can tell, like thousands of people living shoulder to shoulder, generation after generation, in a community that somehow held together without kings, without an obvious class of rulers, perhaps held together instead by the dense web of family and neighbour, and shared ritual by the ancestors under the floors and the horns on the walls and the customs that everyone knew. It is a striking thing to sit with. Here was crowding on a scale never before attempted, and yet not, or not yet, the steep pyramids of power that we tend to assume must come with it. Catalhoyuk seems to suggest that humans first learned to live in great numbers, and only later, somewhere else, learned to let some of those numbers rule over the rest. Picture, then, a single day there, 9,000 years ago. The dawn comes up over the high plain, and the flat roofs of the town begin to stir. Smoke rises from 100 roof holes as the morning fires are fed. People climb up out of their dim houses into the light and move across the rooftops, carrying water, carrying grain, calling to one another, children darting between the openings while mothers watch the edges. Down below in the warm dark, a woman kneels at the grindstone, working the wild and the tamed grain into meal, her knees and her back slowly being reshaped by the labour, the smoke stinging her eyes. Beneath her, under the swept and replastered floor, lie her grandmother and her grandmother's grandmother. On the wall beside her, the great horns of an aurochs jut from the plaster, and above them a painted hunt freezes in mid-leap. This was home, crowded, smoky, close, ringed by the dead and the beasts, and yet home, lived in lovingly enough that people replastered the walls and swept the floors and came back to the same rooftops for more than 1,000 years. But Çatalhöyük, for all its size, was still in a sense a giant village, a vast community of broadly equal households with no great machinery of rule. The final, fateful step, the step that turns a big settlement into a true city, with all its hierarchy and its specialists and its kings, was taken somewhere else, on a flatter, hotter, more difficult land, where the only way to wring food from the ground was to master the water itself. To witness the birth of the city in the fullest sense, we must follow the rivers down, out of the hills, onto the great plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates. It is a strange place for the first cities to have been born, this flat southern plain where the two great rivers wander toward the sea. The land is hot, and in the south it is dry, with little rain to speak of for much of the year. The soil is rich, laid down over ages by the flooding rivers, but without water poured onto it at the right times, it gives nothing. By every obvious measure, it was a harder place to live than the green hills to the north, and yet it was here, in the land the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, that human settlement took its final fateful leap and became the thing we now call the city. The reason is the very harshness of the place, because the one thing that flat plain could offer, if people were willing to work as never before, was water that could be moved. The rivers were there, the Tigris and the Euphrates, carrying the meltwater of distant mountains down across the plain. And someone, long ago on that sun-struck land, understood that if you could cut a channel from the river and lead its water out across the dry fields, you could make the rich soil bloom. This is irrigation, and it changed everything because irrigation is not a thing one family can do alone. To dig the canals, to keep them clear of the silt that forever threatened to choke them, to share the water fairly among many fields, and settle the inevitable disputes over who gets how much and when, to maintain the whole system against flood and drought. You need people working together in large numbers, in an organized way, under some kind of authority that can plan and command and enforce. The land between the rivers could be made staggeringly fertile, more productive than the wild hills had ever been, capable of feeding crowds the foragers could not have dreamed of. But the price of that fertility was organization, and organization on this scale meant the end of the flat and equal world. The first cities rose here, one after another, beginning more than 6,000 years ago. One of the oldest of them all was a place called Eridu, which the Sumerians who lived in this land remembered, in their own stories, as the very first city of all, the place where kingship itself had first come down from heaven to earth. Whether or not it was truly the first, Eridu is staggeringly ancient, a settlement that grew and grew on the southern marshes until it was a true city, with a great temple at its heart that was rebuilt again and again on the same sacred spot across the centuries, each new temple raised upon the levelled ruins of the last, until the holy mound stood high above the plain. But the city that shows us most clearly what had been born here is Uruk. By around 5,000 years ago, Uruk had swollen into something the world had never seen, a city of perhaps tens of thousands of people gathered behind its walls, a density of human life on a scale that simply had no precedent. Walk its remembered streets in your mind, and you would have found something close to the modern condition for the very first time. Most of the people in that city did not grow their own food. They were fed by the surplus of the irrigated fields outside the walls, and that surplus, that mountain of grain wrung from the watered earth, freed an astonishing number of hands to do other things. There were potters who did nothing but make pots, turning them out by the thousand on a new invention. The potter's wheel that let one person produce vessels faster than a whole village once had. There were weavers and metalworkers learning to win copper from stone, and builders and brewers and merchants who carried goods up and down the rivers and far across the land in exchange for the timber and stone and metal that the bare plain did not have. For the first time, a human being could spend a whole life mastering a single craft, fed by the labour of others, and this division of labour, This great splitting up of human work into 1,000 specialties is one of the deepest marks of the city, and one of the engines of everything cities would go on to achieve. And at the heart of it all stood the temple. And the temple was not only a house of the gods. It was the great organizing institution of the early city, a centre that gathered in the surplus grain, that stored it, that managed it, that doled it out to the workers it employed and the specialists it fed. The temple held vast estates, commanded labour, and sat at the centre of the city's economy like a heart-pumping grain instead of blood. And rising over it in time came the form that still says ancient Mesopotamia to us across the ages, the ziggurat, the great step temple tower, an artificial holy mountain of mud brick climbing toward the sky, the home of the city's god lifted high above the rooftops of the people. To stand in early Uruk and look up at that rising mass would have been to understand, without a word spoken, that the flat world of the forager was finished, and that some now stood far above the rest. For with the surplus and the specialists and the temple, and the organizing of so many people toward great shared ends, came the steep new pyramid of power that Çatalhöyük had so strikingly lacked. There were now rulers, kings whose word was law, and priests who spoke for the gods and controlled the storehouses, and below them the great mass of ordinary people who farmed and dug and carried and built. There were those who commanded and those who obeyed. The equality that the wandering life had guarded so jealously, the fierce old levelling that mocked the proud hunter back down to size, was gone, drowned beneath the grain. And to manage all of this, the wealth and the workers, and the debts and the rations and the offerings, the people of these cities reached for one more invention, perhaps the most world-changing of them all. They began to make marks on clay to keep track of it. They began haltingly with little pictures and tallies pressed into wet tablets to record who owed what, and who had paid to write. And once a people can write, they can do something no people had ever truly done before. They can reach across the years and speak to those not yet born. History, in the most literal sense, the recording of human affairs in lasting words, begins here in the accounting of a Mesopotamian temple among the grain and the herds and the ledgers of the first true cities on earth. And once people could write, the marks that began as dry tallies of grain and goats slowly learned to carry other things, until at last they could hold a story. Uruk itself gives us one of the very oldest tales humanity has ever written down. Long after the city's founding, the Mesopotamians remembered a king of Uruk named Gilgamesh, part history and part legend, and they told of him on their clay tablets in what may be the oldest great work of literature in the world. And what does that ancient poem boast of, first of all? The walls it opens by praising the mighty walls of Uruk, urging the listener to walk upon them and marvel at their making, to see the baked brick and know that no later king could ever build their equal. Think on that for a moment as you drift. The very first story our species chose to write down and keep was, in part, a city's pride in itself, in its walls, in the permanence of the place its people had built. The wandering was so wholly forgotten that the oldest tale we have is already a hymn to staying put, to brick and rampart, and the glory of a city that would stand. The forager's open road had passed entirely out of memory, and in its place stood the wall, and the tower, and the boast carved into clay that here, at last, was something built to last forever. So this is where the long road that began with a wandering band beneath the open sky finally arrives. Not at a happier place, but at a vastly more powerful one. Crowds and kings and craftsmen and temples climbing toward heaven and writing to bind it all together and carry it forward forever. The city had been born, but it had not come free. Everything it gave, it also took, and to understand the true bargain our ancestors had been eased into, we must look hard and without flinching at what the city cost. Begin with disease, because the city's first and cruelest tax was paid in sickness. We touched on this when we read the bones of the early farmers, But the city raised it to a new and terrible pitch. A crowd is a feast for a plague. Many of the diseases that have most haunted human history simply cannot sustain themselves in a small, scattered, wandering population. They burn through the few available bodies and then die out for want of new ones to infect. But pack tens of thousands of people together, breathing the same air, drinking from the same fouled water, living amid their own waste and their animals' waste, and you have built the perfect engine for sickness to take hold and never let go. The city gathered people, and in gathering them it gathered their germs and crowd diseases that could never have existed before, found in the dense settlement an endless supply of fresh victims. To live in a city was to live in the constant low shadow of contagion, and waves of pestilence would scythe through these crowded places again and again across the millennia to come. The very density that made the city powerful made it deadly. Then there is the matter of the steep new ladder of rank, and what it meant to stand on its lower rungs. We have watched the old equality vanish, drowned beneath the grain, replaced by kings above and commoners below. But sit for a moment with what that actually meant for a living person. For most of the human story, no one could make you work for them, because there was nothing to make you work for and nowhere they could keep you. But now there was stored wealth, and those who controlled it, the kings and priests and great households, could command the labour of others. They could demand a share of what you grew, the first taxes. They could call you up to dig their canals and build their walls and raise their temples, the first forced labour. And in time, in these early cities and the lands around them, some human beings came to own other human beings outright. The first slaves, captured in war or fallen into debt, their whole lives bent to another's will. The surplus that the city produced did not flow evenly to all. It pooled at the top in the hands of the few, and the many who produced it lived on what those few allowed them. Inequality, in the deep and grinding sense we still know today, the world of the rich and the poor, the master and the servant, was not some ancient and natural condition of humankind. It was a thing that had to be built, and it was built here, on the back of the grain, when the city was young. And there is war. The wandering bands had known violence, certainly feuds, and killings and raids, but organised war as an enterprise of states. Armies marching at a ruler's command to seize the wealth and the land and the people of a rival city. This too seems to swell into something new in the age of the first cities. Think about what the city offered to a covetous neighbour. Concentrated wealth. Storehouses heavy with grain. Workshops full of goods. A whole population that could be conquered and made to labour. The mobile forager had nothing worth an army's trouble to steal, and could in any case simply melt away into the country. But the city could not run. It sat heavy and rich and rooted upon its plain, and so it had to be defended, which is why these cities raised their great walls, the walls that the oldest poems so proudly praised. The wall around the city is a beautiful and a terrible thing at once. It is the mark of a community strong enough to build it, and it is the confession of a world in which one city now had to fear another, in which the rooted wealth of settled life had made organised plunder worthwhile, and war a permanent fixture of the human condition. Even writing, that miraculous invention, wore a darker face. We tend to think of it as a tool of memory and beauty, the keeper of poems and prayers, and the long human conversation across the centuries, and so in time it became. But remember where it was born. It was born in the storehouse, in the accounting of grain and debts and rations. From its very beginning, writing was a tool of administration, a way for those at the top to keep track of what was owed to them, to record your debts and your obligations and your place in the order of things, to make the machinery of taxation and control run smoothly across a population too large to hold in any one mind. The same marks that would one day carry the Song of Gilgamesh first carried the ledger of who owned what and who owed whom. Writing helped the powerful know and to know is very often to control. So that is the bill laid out plainly. Plague bred in the crowd. Kings and taxes and forced labour and slavery, the whole grinding apparatus of inequality. Organised war and the walls raised against it. Even the written word pressed first into the service of control. If you only looked at this ledger, you might conclude that the city was a catastrophe, a vast machine for making most people miserable, so that a few could be powerful, and you would not be entirely wrong. And yet we cannot leave it there, because it would not be honest, and it would not be the whole truth. The same density that bred the plague and the king also bred wonders that the open road could never have produced. Gather enough people in one place, free enough hands from the daily search for food, and human creativity ignites in a way it simply cannot in a scattered band of 30 souls. The city gave us the specialist who could spend a lifetime perfecting a craft, and so it gave us craft of a refinement never seen before. It gave us the surplus and the leisure to wonder, and so it gave us the beginnings of mathematics, born from the same accounting that oppressed the farmer, and astronomy, and medicine, and law written down, so that even a ruler might in principle be bound by it. It gave us monuments that still lift the heart, and music and story and art made by people who had the time to make them. It gathered human minds together in great numbers, and minds gathered together strike sparks off one another, and light fires that a lone mind never could. Everything we most admire in human achievement, and everything we most lament in human cruelty, came bundled together in the same package, on the same plane, at the same time, and could not, it seems, be had one without the other. This is the hardest truth of the whole story, and the one most worth carrying with you into sleep. The city was not a paradise, and it was not a hell. It was a bargain, struck not by anyone's free choice, but by the slow closing of a trap, and the bargain ran in both directions at once. We gave up the freedom and the health and the rough equality of the open road. We received in exchange power and permanence, and the towering achievements that only crowds can build, along with the plagues and the kings and the wars that only crowds can suffer. Whether it was worth it is not a question with an answer. It is only the deepest question our species ever stumbled into, without ever meaning to ask it at all. But there remains one last riddle. If the settled life was so costly, so unequal, so full of new sufferings, why did it not simply collapse? Why did it spread, instead, until it swallowed nearly the whole of humanity? Why are there cities everywhere tonight, and almost no wanderers left at all? The answer is as simple as it is unsettling, and it has almost nothing to do with whether the settled life was good for the people who lived it. The settled life won, not because it made people happier or healthier or freer. It won because it made more of them. It won on sheer numbers. And in the long, pitiless arithmetic of history, numbers are very nearly all that matters. Think back one last time to what we know. A band of foragers spreads thin across a wide land, every family needing a great expanse of country to feed it, the whole group numbering a few dozen souls. A patch of farmland the same size, watered and worked, can feed many times that number, packed close. The settled people were sicker, perhaps, and shorter and less free, but there were vastly more of them living on every square mile of ground. And more people is not just more people. More people means more hands to work and to build, and more backs to carry burdens, and crucially more young men who can be handed a spear and sent out to fight. A single city on its fertile plain could field an army larger than the entire population of all the wandering bands for 100 miles around. When the farmers and the foragers met and wanted the same land, it was very rarely a fair contest. The foragers could fight, or they could flee, or they could themselves take up the plough and the settled life, and so be absorbed into it. But what they could not do in the long run was hold their ground against a way of life that bred 10 or 100 of its people for every one of theirs, and so it spread, not as an idea that delighted people, but as a tide that simply rose. Generation by generation, century by century, the farmers and their fields pushed outward from the first cradles into every valley and plain that could be made to grow grain. Sometimes they came as conquerors, sometimes as settlers filling empty land. Sometimes their way of life spread ahead of them, taken up by foragers who saw the writing on the wall and joined the new order rather than be swept aside by it. The details differed everywhere, but the direction never changed. The wild lands shrank, the farmed lands grew. The wanderers were pushed over thousands of years into the margins, the deserts and the deep forests and the frozen north, the few hard corners of the world that the plough could not reach, while the rich and gentle heart of every continent filled up with fields and villages and, in time, with cities. The open road did not lose because it was worse for the human soul. It lost because it could not match the terrible fertility of the furrow. It is worth slowing down to picture how that advance actually felt on the ground, because it was rarely a battle and almost never a decision. Imagine the edge of the farming world, the slow-moving frontier, where the fields gave way to the wild. On one side, a settled village, its grain pits full, its children many, its numbers swelling every generation until the young had to go looking for new land to clear. On the other, a band of foragers living the old free way across a wide territory. The village does not need to conquer anyone. It simply grows, and its surplus children move out a little way and clear a new patch of ground and start a new village, which in turn grows and sends out its own. Year by year, almost imperceptibly, the fields creep forward, a mile or two in a lifetime, and the wild and the people who lived in it are pushed gently back, not slaughtered, just crowded out, their hunting grounds shrinking, their children drifting off to join the settled life, because there is less and less wild left to live in. Across a few thousand years, that slow, imperceptible creep carried farming clear across whole continents, from the Middle East across the whole of Europe, from the river valleys of Asia outward in every direction, a tide so slow no single person could ever have watched it move, and yet so relentless that it remade the entire face of the earth. And remember those few bands of foragers we met at the very beginning of the night, the ones the anthropologists went to live among, the people who showed us how rich and how free the old way could be. That is who was left. By the time we came at last to study the wandering life, it survived only in the hardest and most remote corners of the world, the deserts and the rainforests and the frozen edges, the places the furrow never reached. The original affluent society had not been wiped out in some single great war. It had simply been crowded over 10,000 patient years off all the good land on earth until it clung on only where the soil was too poor or too harsh for the trap to follow. The wanderers were not conquered. They were outnumbered and outbred, and slowly, gently, almost without malice, pushed to the very ends of the world. There is a hard lesson buried here, and it is worth holding gently because it runs against something we badly want to believe. We like to imagine that history moves toward what is better, that the ways of life which spread and triumph do so because they are, in some deep sense, improvements, kinder or wiser or truer to what we are. The story of the first cities tells us this is not so, or at least not always. A way of life can spread across the whole earth and crush every alternative, not because it makes its people flourish, but only because it makes them many. Success in the brutal accounting of history is not measured in happiness or health or freedom. It is measured in descendants, in sheer surviving numbers, and by that measure, the settled farming city-building life was the most staggering success our species ever stumbled into, whatever it cost the individual bodies that lived it out. The trap did not only close, it bred, and what breeds inherits the earth. So this is the resolution of the long mystery we lay down with tonight. The first cities were not supposed to exist, in the sense that nobody designed them, nobody chose them as an improvement, Nobody could have foreseen them or wanted them from the vantage of the free and healthy wandering life. They were not an upgrade. By the measure of the individual human body and the individual human life, they may even have been, for a very long time, a downgrade. And yet they came because a tangle of forces, a warming and then a freezing climate, a swelling population, the lure of stored abundance, the deep pull of gathering and the sacred, eased and pressed and frightened a few peoples in a few rich valleys across a line they could not then step back over. And once across, the trap closed, and then the trap bred, and the children of the trap, by their sheer multiplying numbers, spread out and inherited the world, until almost every human being alive descended from people who had made that fateful, costly, irreversible passage out of the wandering life. We are those children, every one of us listening tonight, in whatever city or town or quiet room, is a descendant of the trapped, not the free. The wanderers were our ancestors too, far enough back, but the line that leads to us runs through the ones who stayed, who stored the grain and buried their dead beneath the floor, and raised the wall and dug the canal and bowed, at last, to the king. Their bargain is our inheritance, their trap is the ground we stand on. And the strangeness of that, the sheer improbable weight of it, is a thing worth feeling, just once, as the night comes down. Because the story does not end on that Mesopotamian plain. The seed that was planted there, the city, the settled life, the rooted and crowded and powerful way of being human, grew and grew across the thousands of years that followed, until it became the water we swim in, so total and so familiar that we forget it was ever otherwise. And to feel the full strange weight of what those first reluctant settlers set in motion, we have only to look up, tonight, from wherever we lie, at the world their long-ago bargain finally made. Look up, then, in your mind, at the world tonight, not the world of 10,000 years ago, but this one, the one you are lying in. More than half of all the human beings alive now live in cities, and the share grows every single year. The trap that first closed around a few thousand people in a handful of warm valleys has, in the blink of an eye that is 10 millennia, closed around 8 billion. Every city on earth, every glittering tower and tangled suburb, every traffic-choked street and quiet sleeping bedroom, every place where people live rooted in one spot and fed by the labour of others, is a descendant of those first reluctant settlements. The whole vast machinery of the modern world, the farms that feed the cities, and the cities that command the farms, the governments and the markets, and the armies and the laws, all of it grew, in an unbroken line, from the choice that was never really a choice, made on the banks of those ancient rivers, and in the shadow of that temple on the hill. And it did not only build our world, it built us, the people we are inside, in ways so deep we mistake them for human nature itself. Think of how much of your life is shaped by things that simply did not exist for the wandering bands. The very idea of owning a piece of the earth, a plot of land with a line around it that is yours and not your neighbour's, an idea that would have been almost meaningless to a forager, is the bedrock of the settled world, and we have built our laws and our wars and our dreams of security upon it. The clock and the calendar, the dividing of time into a strict grid of hours and days and seasons to be planted and harvested and accounted for, was born of the farmer's need to do the right thing at the right moment or lose the year. The habit of obedience, of answering to those above us, of taking our place on a ladder of rank that runs from the powerful down to the powerless, a thing the fierce equality of the old life would have found monstrous, has become so ordinary to us that we hardly see it. Even our restlessness, our nagging sense that we ought to be producing more, storing more, getting ahead, securing the future against a hunger that never quite comes, may be an echo of the granary and the long anxious watch over the stored grain. We carry the first cities inside us. We think their thoughts. We feel their fears. There is a strange grief in seeing it clearly, and also a strange tenderness, a grief because we can glimpse now what was traded away, The spaciousness and the freedom and the rough equality and the deep health of a way of living that suited our bodies and our spirits for hundreds of thousands of years, and that we will almost certainly never have again. We are the heirs of a bargain we did not strike and cannot undo, settled into a life that our own bones, if we could read them as we read the ancient ones, might still quietly protest. Somewhere far down in us, perhaps, there lingers a memory of the open road, and it stirs when we stand at the edge of a wild place and feel something loosen in the chest, some old and wordless homesickness for a country we have never seen. But there is tenderness in it too, and it would be wrong to end on grief alone. Because those first settlers, trapped and aching and sicker than their parents, also reached for something the wanderers never could. They gathered together in numbers great enough to dream great dreams and make them real. Everything tender and magnificent that human beings have made since, every cathedral and every symphony, every kind law and every healing medicine, every word written down so that a stranger 1,000 years away might read it and feel less alone. Every one of these things grew from the same crowded, rooted, difficult soil where the city first took hold. The wanderers were free, and they were healthy, and they were, in their way, content. But they could not have built the thing that lets my voice reach you now across all the distance between us, in the dark. The settled life cost us a great deal. It also gave us each other, in numbers and in nearness, the open road could never have allowed. So here is the whole of it, the long thread we have followed all the way down into the night, from a small band beneath the open sky, owning nothing, free to walk away from anything, to a sleepy Natufian village with its dead beneath the floor, from a temple raised by hunters on a lonely hill to the first wall thrown up around the first town, from a honeycomb of roof-walked houses on a high plain to a great city of tens of thousands gathered around a tower climbing toward its god, with kings in their courts and scribes pressing the first words into clay. A single unbroken thread, running from the campfires of the deep past straight through to the city lights you might see tonight, if you rose and went to the window. The same glowing crowds, the same rooted lives, the same ancient bargain, still being lived, still being paid for, still, in its way, the strangest thing our species ever did. We were never supposed to be here, in these cities of ours. And yet here we are, all 8 billion of us, the children of the people who could not go back. It is a strange inheritance to fall asleep inside of, but it is ours, and it is wondrous, and it is the only home we have ever really known. So let the whole long story settle over you now, soft as a blanket, as we come to the end of it. We began with a question that sounds almost like a riddle. If the settled life made people shorter and sicker and harder worked and less free, then who on earth chose it, and why did it spread until it swallowed the world? And the answer in the end was that no one quite chose it at all. It was less a triumph than a trap, a door that swung shut behind a few peoples in a few rich valleys, one small reasonable step at a time, until the open road was gone and there was nowhere left to go but forward, into the village, into the town, into the city, into all of this. The first cities were not supposed to exist, and yet, out of that closing trap, out of the grain pits and the buried dead and the walls and the canals and the long obedience to kings, came everything we are. The cost was real. The wonder is real too. They were always, from the very first furrow, the same thing. I hope as you drift, that you carry just a little of that wonder down into sleep with you. The strange and lovely thought that you are a child of those reluctant settlers, that the room you are lying in tonight is the distant descendant of a round mud house, beside a wild field 12,000 years ago, and that the long unbroken thread of human staying put runs straight from their hands to yours. Let the images of it drift past you now, one last time like faces seen from a slow train at dusk, with no need to hold on to any of them. A band of wanderers on a green and empty plain, carrying everything they own in their 2 hands, A Natufian woman laid to rest with her hand resting gently on the body of a small dog 12,000 years ago. Hunters dragging a great carved stone across a hilltop to raise a temple for gods whose names we will never know. A wall rising course by course around a town beside a faithful spring, and inside it, a family keeping the plastered face of a grandfather on a shelf, his shell eyes watching over the rooms. Thousands of people climbing down through holes in their roofs, into warm, dim houses, lying down to sleep above the bones of their ancestors. A city on a hot plain, its tower climbing toward the sky, a scribe in its shadow pressing the very first words into soft, wet clay. And then, at the far end of that long, long thread, you, here, now, in the dark, the inheritor of all of it, listening as the story comes to rest. There is nothing you need to do with these pictures. Just let them pass and fade and carry you down. Before I let you go, let me ask you the same small thing I always do, in case you are still half awake to hear it. If you have enjoyed wandering back through the deep past with me tonight, it would mean a great deal if you would take a quiet moment, whenever you wake, to like this video, and to leave a comment, and to subscribe, so that more of these long, sleepy histories can find their way to you in the nights to come. And in that comment, tell me again where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love reading them, picturing all of us scattered across the dark side of the turning world. One of you in a city that never sleeps. One of you in a farmhouse far from any town. One of you in a place whose name I will have to look up on a map. All of us awake together for a little while in the quiet, kept company by the same old story of where we came from. And if these nighttime journeys into the lost ages are something you have come to love, you might like to know that we have gathered a great deal more of this. The strangest and most beautiful secrets of the prehistoric world, the deep human story from long before the first city was ever dreamed of, into a book of our own. If you would like to wander further into these mysteries at your own pace, you can read more about it and find it on our website at sleepytimehistory.com. There is no need to remember it now. It will keep until morning like the grain in the old stone pits, waiting quietly for whenever you are ready. But for now there is nothing left to do, and nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to remember. The fires of the first villages have long since burned down to embers. The walls of the first towns have crumbled back into the hills. The first kings are dust, and the first scribes and the first farmers who bent their backs over the first fields, all of them gone, all of them quiet now, all of them resting, at last beneath the floors of the world they built for us without ever knowing we would come. You are the far end of their long story. You are the reason it was all for something. And you do not have to do a single thing about that tonight, except to let your breathing slow and your thoughts grow soft and far away, and your hold on the day loosen, finger by finger, the way the wanderers once loosened their hold on the open road. Rest now. The night is long, and the story will keep. Sleep well wherever you are, whatever time it is, and I will see you again soon, somewhere a little further back in the dark.